This podcast is produced by Benchmark Education.
What are we learning about how children learn to read? And how does that inform our instructional practices? In this episode, forget polarizing conversations around the science of reading. Instead, here's a focus on practical ways that theory meets practice in the literacy classroom. I'm Kevin Carlson, and this is Teachers Talk Shop.
Instead of thinking about what side of the fence we're on, we need to kind of find the gate in the fence, and we need to open that gate because there are things to be learned from both sides, and there is definitely more common ground.
That is Dr. C.C. Bates, author of Interactive Writing, Developing Readers Through Writing. She is a professor of literacy education at Clemson University and the director of the Clemson University Reading Recovery and Early Literacy Training Center. Author and educator Patty McGee talked with CC recently about using all we know about the sciences of reading to accelerate student learning. Here are Patty McGee and Dr. CC Bates.
I thought we could get together and have a conversation where we're bringing in the perspective of the sciences of reading and using all we know about the sciences of reading to accelerate student learning. So maybe we can begin just by talking about what we know is out there right now. There's a lot of tension that we've noted around reading instruction, and these tensions tend to make us pause and really affirm, rethink, revise our practices with students. And so I'm wondering if you could just maybe start us off with some of the things that you've been thinking about in terms of the tensions.
Sure. I think that if we're not careful, this conversation around the teaching of reading becomes very polarizing, and people fall out on I guess on different sides of the fence. And I really wholeheartedly believe that everyone is here because they believe in empowering children to become literate. I think that instead of thinking about what side of the fence we're on, we need to kind of find the gate in the fence, and we need to open that gate, and we need to make sure that we are listening to the other side. And that we are really thinking through what we know and what we're learning about how children learn to read and how that informs our instructional practices, because there are things to be learned from both sides. And there is definitely, I think, more common ground. And when we get into these conversations, oftentimes on social media, you see these kind of polarizing comments. I don't think that's in the best interest of children or teachers.
Yes, I hear you. And like you said, I think we have more in common. And I really think that common thread is that we all want to support students in becoming stronger and stronger readers.
After the break, making the theoretical practical. Stay with us. In Interactive Writing, Developing Readers Through Writing, Dr. C.C. Bates explores what interactive writing is and how it connects oral language, writing, and reading. When teachers understand those connections, they can help all students, including striving readers and English learners, advance and thrive as readers. In this professional development book, teachers will find tips on how to introduce, model, and practice interactive writing routines, and save time by incorporating them throughout the school day, tying science, math, and social studies content in with reading and writing. The book also spotlights different types of formative assessments that help determine where students are in their learning and how to support their progress. Learn more at pdessentials.com. Go teach brilliantly.
There's a lot of theoretical conversation that happens among grown-ups and teaching reading, and that's really important. And what I think is equally, or maybe even more important, is now how do we take the theoretical and make it practical at the classroom level?
I think, Patty, first of all, we have to know why we're doing what we're doing. So the rationale for the decisions that we make in a classroom is so important. And what feeds into that rationale is a deep knowledge and understanding about literacy and literacy processing. So I think sometimes where there's a disconnect is in the language that we use. So I may, in my work with children, refer to a letter combination or a part, and I know how to speak to both audiences. So I can clearly identify the difference between a phoneme and a grapheme. And I can use that language in conversations with colleagues at the university level, but that's not the language I'm using with children. And I think that's often the case with teachers. They understand what they're doing with children, but they may not use the language that represents that to researchers, to policymakers. And so oftentimes I think that there's this confusion around how teachers are coming to teach reading. And there's I think at some levels, and maybe this goes back to the first question about these tensions in the field, a mistrust that teachers don't know what they're doing. And so we're going to simplify this and give them a prescription that every teacher is going to follow for every child. And what we know is that children are very individual in their learning trajectory. And so when we follow, a lockstep prescription and we don't differentiate for children that are already know and control all of the skills that are set before me as a first grade teacher, or children that still are working on recognizing the letters in their name when I'm supposed to be teaching consonant digraphs, there's a disconnect there. And so as a teacher, I have to figure out how to differentiate my instruction to meet the needs of my learners. And I think, really need to feel empowered as an educator that I know what I'm doing, that I have a strong rationale for the decisions that I'm making. And so I think part of that to elevate this conversation is to help teachers own that language around literacy, teaching, and learning, and to be able to clearly articulate that they do know the difference between phonological and phonemic awareness. So I think that at some levels, we don't always give educators the credit that they deserve, that they are professionals and they know their jobs. So I think, kind of unpacking some of that language, being very clear, that we understand that a phoneme, is that individual sound unit, and that a grapheme is the letter or letters that represent that sound. So, I think sometimes when teachers are in pre-service programs, we teach those things, but they get out in the field and now all of a sudden they've got a child that's having difficulty. And so, going back, I think, and engaging in ongoing professional learning where we revisit some of these concepts that were taught in a pre-service program now in light of individuals in their current context. So what does that mean for me as a second grade teacher with a child or children in my second grade class that are reading well below grade level? So, understanding that language in light of our current context and revisiting how that changes from child to child and grade level to grade level. I think those are important things that we need to understand. There's a lot of conversation right now about phonemic awareness and about phonics. And I think really being clear about the definitions and terms that we're using so that we are all speaking the same language. Yes. So that if I'm in a conversation with school administrators and teachers that and parents, that everyone is on the same page. And when we talk about, children having challenges around some of these issues, that we are using a common language. So there's no concern that, well, the teacher doesn't really understand. And it may be because she's referring to some of the things that she's doing in the classroom in the ways in which she would talk to the children about those things. And, when I'm talking with children, I use terminology that's very different than I'm going to use with educators. And that's even different than oftentimes the ways in which I engage parents in conversation around the teaching of reading, because there's a different level of understanding for all of those players.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's so wise to say, because if we can't speak a common language around supporting children, and knowing that that language is going to shift with different people, depending on who we're talking to, but knowing that language across, like you said, with children, with parents, with colleagues, with in professional settings, when we speak that common language, we are better able to communicate, especially around what you said earlier about where we have more common ground than we don't. So what comes to mind then, after thinking about this common language, what comes to mind for me as an educator then is, how do teachers go about finding those places and spaces within student learning to be able to figure out where instruction is most needed and what instruction is most needed. So of course, I'm coming then to assessment. So
Sure.
could you give us, I know this is like a full college course, but if you could give us just some important things that as educators to either validate or remind us of assessing the whole student reader. Of course, keeping sciences of reading in mind, but as we think about this practical part of looking at the whole reader, can you just give us a couple of things to think about?
Sure. And I say this pretty regularly. I think sometimes assessment is almost a dirty word.
Mm.
It comes with so much baggage, but it really is what drives our instructional decision making. So I think sometimes it gets tangled up with standardized assessments and summative assessments, where we're only looking at what children can do at the end of the school year. But really, as a teacher, what I need to know is how I'm going to get them from point A to point B. So it's really using assessments to determine where students are. And as an educator, it's incumbent upon me as a professional to understand that developmental continuum and the educational expectations for the grade level that I'm teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to use that information in tandem to really kind of chart a path for a child's accelerative progress. I have to know, what this child knows and controls. And I have to see how that fits within the overall understanding of what a first grader is supposed to know and understand in my particular district, in my particular state. So that also means how the standards, my state standards, play into those educational expectations. And then it's really easy to see how each child's path is going to be different.
Mm.
So, I mentioned just a couple seconds ago about having children, at all different points in their literacy journey, in a first, second grade, kindergarten classroom. I mean, we could name any point in a child's K-12 education and see how children are progressing at different rates, how they have different strengths, and they bring to bear different things on their learning. And so, as a teacher, if I don't know clearly that this particular child that I'm working with is a confusion between, let's say, H and N and R, because those letters are all so visually similar, and that child's still trying to sort that out, and I'm teaching for that. But my prescription that is mandated at the district level or at the school level tells me that I'm supposed to be working on consonant digraphs, and I'm teaching SH. Well, I've got to really now think about that scope and sequence continues to march on. It doesn't matter that this child is still trying to sort out the difference between H and N and R and how they, looks very, very similar. And so I've got to make sure that as this marches on, I'm still teaching this particular child.
Yes.
And so I think that's where we have to really think about, children holistically, and that I'm not teaching a class of 25, I'm teaching 25 individuals that each have very unique strengths and are on different paths on that continuum.
After the break, Cece Bates gets practical about grouping. Stay with us. With so many decodable readers available, how can teachers know which ones will best meet the needs of their young students? The latest science of reading research identifies 3 key factors that a decodable text must have to support effective reading instruction. They should be instructive, engaging, and comprehensible. And these 3 characteristics are present in all Benchmark Education's decodable readers. Author and phonics expert Wiley Blevins.
For students, these stories and informational texts give them lots of opportunities to practice, extend, and refine their knowledge of sound spelling relationships so they can get to mastery faster.
To learn more about Wiley Blevins and Benchmark Education's decodable readers, visit us at benchmarkeducation.com.
You notice that students are having difficulty with this particular area, say the difference between R, N, and H as letters. But the curriculum is saying that we should be teaching this, like you said, digraphs. How then does a teacher make a decision instructionally about that? Like, what are some things that we can, as educators, practically do when we have both the curriculum and also the information in front of us? What are some ideas you have for
Good
us?
question. I think, first of all, we have to be very careful about the way in which we engage in grouping practices, right? So if I'm expected to teach whole group all day long, I'm going to have a very difficult time differentiating my instruction to meet the needs of those individual students in my classroom. So I'm really looking to use that assessment to inform the ways in which I group children. So I may need to work with a child one-on-one. I may need to pull a small group. I need to recognize that just because I pull a small group of children doesn't mean that those children should be slated in that small group all year long.
Right.
So there should be an ebb and flow in our grouping practices based on the patterns that we're seeing from the data that we're collecting and how we are using those formative assessments to better understand our students and their needs. So I definitely think that it's around our grouping practices. It relates to differentiated instruction. And it's also in those moments when I am teaching whole group, knowing how I can then tailor and adjust instruction to meet the needs of individuals in the moment.
Yes.
So, that's a lot. I think we have to be very systematic in our assessments. We have to be very organized in the way we keep up with those assessments. And it also involves a level of reflective practice on my part as a teacher. So if I don't sit down at certain points, in the day when that's possible, and at the end of the day and reflect on what's happened, I'm not going to remember,
Right.
By the next day. I mean, really by probably later that afternoon, that gets lost in a sea of all of the other, interactions that take place within a primary grades classroom or any classroom for that matter. So I think being, again, detailed in the ways in which we record the observations that we're making, and then using those observations, not just getting them down, on some kind of sticky note that's going to then transfer into perhaps a checklist on certain skills that I'm looking to see children control, but that I actually engage in that reflective practice, as I mentioned, so I can then use that information moving forward.
Yes.
I mean, it's really a multifaceted process. It's not, I can't do any one part and expect to meet the needs of children. Though all of those pieces, not only the observation, but the ways in which I record my observations, the ways in which I go through and then look for patterns and trends across what children are taking on, so that during that whole group lesson, I know which children I can then, for example, during interactive writing, call up to a chart to add to what we're getting down on paper, because for that particular child, there's going to be a connection there. It's right at their critical point of something that they're taking on and they're learning. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm just thinking about that and putting kind of what you said into some practical steps that almost summarizing what you're saying here, Cece. So what I think you're saying, and tell me if this is correct, is first, we know it's important for us as educators to know what we're assessing, and whatever lingo we're using with different people, we all know what we're assessing, and we're assessing that whole child. And as we are assessing that whole child more in a formative type of way, rather than, in a summative way, we're looking all the time at what students know, almost know, and not yet know, or as you say, control, maybe almost control or not yet control. And then we're making instructional choices based on that. And those instructional choices can be in grouping. It can also be in the content that we choose, and also in the practices, just like interactive writing is one of those practices. So definitely. I think, did I miss a step in there?
No, I think that's a great summary. And I'll tell you, the end goal, is everyone has to know, right? SH, for example.
Yes.
So it's not that I don't expect the child who's still sorting out the difference between these visually similar letters not to get there. But if I don't deal with the confusions first, I'm never going to get them to recognize, this letter combination that produces the sound. So it's really important for me to know and to dig down, because if I just expect the child to take this on and I think, well, they're not learning it, but I don't drill down, I may not recognize that this is where the confusion lies, right? So I've got to sort this out before I can move on to the grade level expectation of whatever it is. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And I guess some of almost layman's words that are coming to mind is that teachers are detectives first, that we're seeking out what it is that is the confusion, and we're finding that. And we know what our destination is, but we're looking for the places that are challenging, Yes.
And, I go back to the title of one of Mari Clay's books that she wrote, By Different Paths to a Common Outcome, right? And that is, we all have the same end goal. Mm-hmm. But the ways in which children get there are going to be vastly different. And it's not just because one child may have some, confusion around a few letters. It's also because children bring, each child brings a unique perspective to their journey as a literacy learner. And that includes, their culture and, their motivation to engage with text. And there's so much that feeds into that. So that piece too is so important, that we understand our children and those funds of knowledge that they bring to the school setting, and that we recognize those and value those and honor those as part of what takes them on that unique path to that common outcome.
Yes, absolutely. And you know what, I think those are beautiful words to end on. That really, we're working with children, we're teaching children, we're educators of children, and we're looking at the whole child, not just their cognitive skills, but also who they are as humans, what they bring with them, their experiences, their motivations. It's a human experience teaching reading.
Thank you, Patty McGee. Thank you, Dr. C.C. Bates, and thank you for listening to Teachers Talk Shop. If you want to learn more about the science of reading, go to teacherstalkshop.com and visit our archive. Episode 25 is called The Sciences of Reading and the Whole Child, featuring Peter Afflerbach and Rachel Gabriel. Episode 20, Expanding the Science of Reading, features Peter Afflerbach. And Episode 4 features Wiley Blevins and is called The Science of Reading, What Brain Research Says About How We Learn to Read. While you're on the site, please register to receive updates about the show. For Benchmark Education, I'm Kevin Carlson.